Welcome back to another year-end book wrap-up, where I ask the question, how many books did I read over the past year that I completely forgot about? Oh, and I guess I'll talk briefly about what I read too. According to Goodreads, I read 46 books, which kind of seems a bit lower than usual, but here we are. Up first, I read Because of You by Jessica Scott, which can't possibly be right since I seem to recall having finished some other book for the blog first, but whatever. I'm only going off of what Goodreads is telling me, or to be damned, I guess. Anyway, I barely remember reading it, but barely is good enough. It's what I'm going to lump together as generic soldier romance that I read because of a secret project. And if you haven't figured out what my secret projects are by the end of this video, that's kind of on you. I seem to recall that Because of You ended on a cliffhanger, which is bad enough as it is, but I also rated it 2 stars. If I had read it for the blog, I probably wouldn't have been half as pissed off about that cliffhanger. Then I read Making Faces by Amy Herman. It's probably the only 5-star read from this year, and I'm sad to report that. In the book, people's lives are rocked after September 11th, 2001. A young man signs up for the military and convinces his friends to do the same. However, he's the only one of the friend group who makes it home after that, and he hides away because of the shame, but also because of the immense scarring he suffered. Meanwhile, Fern's life remains mostly untouched back home. She notes that Ambrose has come home now and is a little terrified of him. Their lives come back together in unexpected ways. However, their town is shaken when another tragedy strikes a small town, leaving everybody reeling from the loss. Overall, this story was full of emotions that I feel a lot of stories don't even get close to understanding, let alone approaching, which is why I gave it 5 stars. Up next, I read Houston, We Have a Problem by Erin McCarthy, which I talked about more in my Do These Fictional Doctors Deserve Love video. In it, a doctor convinces an intern doctor to have a one-night stand with him, and then the two of them spend the rest of the book trying to convince themselves that they aren't in love with each other. Bland, boring, I almost forgot about it, but I didn't, so here we are. Then there's Doctor Down by Kay Webster, another book from my Do These Fictional Doctors Deserve Love video. In it, a doctor falls in love with his teenage patient who comes in. She refuses to admit that she has kidney failure, but he convinces her that she does. They have a weird romantic relationship that it's nothing but sunshine and rainbows. They adopt a bunch of kids in the end. It was awful in the worst way imaginable. I'm obviously going to lump all of these books together, but I finished up the rest of the Fated Alpha series by Ava Mason. The series we're aware of picks up a reverse harem and a bunch of dragons. Overall, I thought that it was okay, especially as far as Omegaverse stories go. It dragged on for a lot longer than it should have, especially when you stop to consider the fact that the first couple of books were like 6 chapters each for no real reason. It should have been condensed down to maybe 3 books for the max. Why it wasn't is beyond me. The ending of the series was really bad since the last book about Elizabeth, with its promise of pregnancy and baby happy ending, was literally nothing but a really long ad for a spin-off series about a character introduced in that book. I hate it when authors do that. Give us closure about Lizzie, please. I'm not going to read more of your book simply to find out that she gave birth. I also finished up the Janitor series by Tyler Whitesides. It's probably one of the best things that I've read for the blog, hands down. I think it really helped that I've never seen a book about janitors, full stop. Forget the magic element there, the janitor aspect has really made it unique. Doing an awful lot of series wrap-ups right now. Up next was the end of the Maidenship series by Michelle Rickman. I don't really recall how it ended, only I remember how disappointed that I was over the entire thing. I seem to recall pointing out how paper-thin the villain was, how he had 0 character development. What was he fighting for? Who knows? Not the author, that's for sure. The series also fell into the category of it had a lot of potential but it fell flat, which longtime followers of mine know that it's the worst category. It could have been good, but it wasn't. What's simply worse than it's simply awful, because with a really bad book, you have no idea how to fix it without binning the entire thing. Also, this book was published by a woman who openly brags about how she started her own publishing house simply to publish herself, and she left reviews on all of her books. For shame. Up next, I read Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Canas. I have a lot of unkind things to say about this book as well as the author. However, I try to stick to the facts presented within only the book, so that's what I'm going to be focused on. The story was really long and had wet rice paper thin plot. I wrote in my review that never once in the 300 pages managed to convince me that these people were actually in love. And I also kind of went off about the history of vampires in pop culture and how historically inaccurate that it was. Now, I'm sure that if I knew more about Mexican history, I would probably find a lot of inaccuracies about the war that they were fighting as well. However, I don't know much, so it's difficult to comment about that. As I said, I don't have a lot of nice things to say about the author, and this is a huge part of why. The most insulting part about the Vampires of El Norte is the fact that despite vampires being in the title, they had nothing to do with the story, nor did Mexico have any bearing on the actual plot, which again, tissue paper is thicker than the plot. Then I read the Hunter Moon Academy series by Simone Leah Martin, which was, well, it wasn't a Mugiverse series, so how do you think it went? It had a lot of men fighting each other in order to hook up with one girl whose personality makes a sea sponge seem exciting in comparison. The actual story was beyond boring and dragged on for much longer than it should have. It was only 4 books, but I think that it could have and should have been condensed down to 2. This is a terrible thing to say, but at one point I recall begging for some of the men to stop threatening to rape Vale and simply do it, because then at least something would happen. And again, I know that it's terrible, but I also feel like it's highlighting how desperate that I was for literally anything to happen. Anything. Up next, upon my husband's urging, I read the first 2 books of the Cormoran Strike series by Robert Galbraith, aka J.K. Rowling. Yes, that J.K. Rowling. There are currently 8 books in this series, but after slogging through over 8,000 combined pages of little plot and mostly padding about the most asinine topics imaginable, I decided to throw in the towel. My main problem with this series is the fact that, in order to paint the titular Cormoran Strike as a detective genius, Miss Rowling had to make every other person be dumber than soup, times 10. It wasn't half as evident in the first books, where he worked on a case the police had previously decided was suicide. But in the second book, with a fresh murder, it was like, why aren't the police doing their job? Oh, you've already made up your mind about what happened? Why the hell are you here if you're simply going to throw somebody in prison for simply breathing wrong? It made no sense, and it was endlessly frustrating. The books only get longer as the series goes on. The literal only reason why these were picked up was simply because, even using a pen name, there's still a famous name attached to them. The only reason why the books are even being read is, again, because of the leaked name. I don't believe for a second that the leak wasn't planned from the get-go. I talked about how I wanted to see how many books that I'd forgotten over the past year, but honestly like to forget that I'd read these moronic books. Then I read The Golem and the Genie by Helene Wecker. It was picked up in an attempt to read a different sort of book, with the decision to read something by a Jewish author, not about the Holocaust and written in the 21st century. I found 2 books and I struck out with both of them big time. In it, a Jewish golem meets up with a Middle Eastern genie. I had kind of gone in with the anticipation that it would be more of a romance novel. Instead, it was this bizarre exploration of what does it mean to be alive. There was a sequel after it, but I had zero interest in reading more. The first book was enough of a slog as it was, with subplots that popped up and were never resolved in any way. It wasn't the worst book that I read this year by far, but it's one of those it's art things that left me wondering, why do people find this enjoyable? I seriously want to know. Up next was The Unsung Hero by Suzanne Brockman. This was yet another military romance that mixed a present-day plot with a girl-next-door romance and a World War II plot with 2 soldiers pining after a French woman who didn't make it through the war. I mainly remember the switching plot lines, but the summary doesn't even mention any of that. It was literally half of the book, and nobody thinks to mention that it's half historical fiction. I don't exactly remember a lot of the present-day romance. Probably because they're all a little cookie-cutter after a while, but I remember the tragedy of the French woman during World War II. Then I read The Looking Glass Illusion by Sarah Ella, which is the conclusion to the Wonderland Trials that I read for YouTube last year. I wanted to like this. The problem is that I feel like both of these books should have sat in a folder for a few months, and then Sarah Ella should have worked on the entire thing for like a year before she tried to approach a publisher about it. I don't know what happened. The setup was literally right there, and the author somehow fumbled every single thing at the end. I haven't read something that frustrated me this badly in such a long time. I'm honestly not sure that I'll ever get over the betrayal of this awful story. Then I read Delicious Monsters by Lucille Sam Berry. It was a really good story, but in that tragically beautiful sort of way. The story mostly follows Daisy and her mom as they move to the other side of Canada in a house her brother-in-law left upon his death. However, the house is not as it seems, and Daisy is quickly folded into drama caused by dead people. As the story unfolds, we learn about the abuse her mother suffered as a child because of her brother-in-law, but also the abuse that her own mother in turn made Daisy also endure. As that's unfolding, we also follow Brittany, a video journalist from 10 years in the future, who is doing a story on the so-called murder house investigation. As we're going through, the reader is not quite certain that Daisy is even alive in Brittany's present day. It was an interesting read, but it was difficult to get through because of the rampant abuse I mentioned earlier, so please take note. Up next, I tackled My Last Innocent Year by Daisy Alpert Florin, and I've heard about stories like this before. I simply never thought that I'd actually be misfortunate enough to somehow stumble upon one. This is also the second Jewish novel. It's a story practically as old as literature itself. A young college girl is seduced by her older married professor, and then she wonders where it is that her life went wrong when her month-long relationship with said professor falls apart, and she's left scrambling with no job or backup plan post-college. I wouldn't wish a story like this on anybody. Satan finds better pleasure in torturing others with the likes of 50 Shades rather than awful garbage like this. And because I was apparently on quite the horror thrill streak this year, 5 Survived by Holly Jackson. And I have to tell you, that name was 100% a choice. Nothing quite like putting how the book ends as the title. 6 kids go on a spring break in a rented RV are pinned down by a crazed gunman who seems to think that one of them has an important secret to share. However, most of the actual plot takes place in the last quarter of the book. Everything up until that point felt like the slowest, most meandering and maddening plotting imaginable. Once stuff actually did start to happen, things started to happen pretty fast. I kind of wish that the story had started at that point and moved forward with the stuff that unfolded after all of the nasty business came to light. Despite the spoiler in the title, I refuse to give further info about why all of this happened to start with. And then, in a TikTok made me read it moment, Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. At the heart of it, it's a pretty basic enemies to lover story with pretty basic steamy scenes that had me questioning why people are so nuts about the story. If this book was a spice, it'd be flour. But by the time I somehow managed to slog through to the end, nobody knows why this book is as long as it is. I was under the impression that the romance was supposed to be secondary. Why? Because the story is about shucking old and harmful habits, especially bad people in your life, and learning how to live without them. And I think that that's way more interesting story. It still doesn't explain why this book is half as popular as it is. Like, girl, please go read some Harry Potter fanfic, Spice. I promise you that it's going to be so much better. Then I read The Beautiful series by Jamie McGuire. I think that this was supposed to be some sort of spin-off series of some other characters, but the first book was pretty standalone and I wasn't lost. However, there was never any indication in the front of either of the books I read that there was supposed to be a reading order, so when I picked up the sequel, I was a little lost about drama from so-called side characters. Insanely poor planning on the author's part. If I had to pick another story to compare this one to, it would be the After series by Anna Todd. Something that clearly started life off as a One Direction Wattpad fanfic and somehow found its way onto a bookshelf near you. It was a fairly standard plot of, he's a dangerous bad boy, I'm a girl who wears cardigans, we don't have anything in common, but oh, he makes me feel so good, until he breaks my heart, but it's okay because he said that he was going to change, but then he didn't, and we broke up again. Like I said, it was the After series all over again. Bland, boring, forgettable. The follow-up book was badly organized and not advertised as needing to have read the others first. Up next was Jocelyn's Choice by Ella Jade, and let me tell you that reading this was a choice. In it, a barely 18-year-old Jocelyn is wooed by the older brother of her best friend who ends up impregnating her right before he leaves to go back to college in another state. However, despite the fact that this book is called Jocelyn's Choice, we never actually see her having any sort of emotional decision about if she wants to keep the baby. Mainly, her choice is that she's not going to tell the baby daddy so she doesn't want to ruin his future, but she's perfectly fine ruining her own life by having this baby. Then I read Temptation by A.B. Smoke. This is one of those books for that side project. However, the longer that I got into this particular project, the more I'm like, the plot of all of these books are pretty much copy-pasted over and over. I read the synopsis of this one, and I couldn't remember if this is the one where X happened, Y happened, Z. They're all the same, kind of the same after a while. These college student-teacher romances are seriously not it. Up next, I read the Zodiac Series by Romania Russell, and let me tell you something. I'm a Zodiac girly. I love anything to do with the Zodiac, and I was all like, all right, let's read this. This is going to be interesting. However, this is one of those series where I was constantly disappointed at every turn. I'm not quite finished with the third book as of writing this up, and I don't think that I'll be able to finish it before January. But at the same time, zero character growth and development. Every single character was doing the same stupid stuff in book 3 as they were in book 1. So much wasted potential with this series, and you guys know how much I hate that word. Then I read... I wish I was kidding about this title, but The Boy Who Sneaks in My Bedroom Window by Kirsty Mosley. Yeah, I think you all know why I had to read it. The story was kind of divided between two different plots, one where Amber was abused by her father, and one where every teenager in this story was a horny mess. And I think that there could have been a good story about a teenage girl trying to find love after having been abused so badly by her own father, and the book kind of wanted to go there, but in the end the story would then swirl so rapidly between the two plots that my head would start to spin. One minute Amber would be crying about how she didn't want anybody to touch her, then she'd beg Liam to have his way with her. Pick a lane here, book. Up next was Unraveling Oliver by Liz Nugent. The story promised to be a character study, but I knew everything that I needed to know about the titular Oliver on page 1 of chapter 1. The subsequent chapters only further beat the readers around the head with how completely psychotic that Oliver was, with little reasoning other than, my daddy treated me like I didn't exist. He didn't even physically hurt the boy, yet Oliver himself grew up to murder 3 people and tried to pass off his trauma as being inherited. Somehow. Then I read Lights Out by Nevessa Allen. It promised to be a dark rom-com, however I found that it wasn't dark, it wasn't funny, and it wasn't romantic. 3 strikes and you're out. In it, an ER nurse is obsessed with a random man's thirst trap TikTok videos. When the man in question finds out that she's his roommate's ex-girlfriend, he starts stalking her. And let me tell you, I've read stalker romances before. The fact that I don't like them isn't important here, but after you've read a book about a man who fell asleep under a woman's bed, a guy who hacks security cameras at the hospital seems kind of lame in comparison. The romance aspect was also a huge letdown. They had this knife play scene, but when it came time for the two leads to actually bang, they did it in the most basic way imaginable. How do you build up so much and then fail so hard so quickly? Up next was Worth the Fall by Claudia Connor, and this is yet another book from one of my 2 secret projects. I hope that you're starting to see a picture emerging about both of them at this point. In it, a Navy SEAL sees a single mother struggling with her kids at the beach and plays with the kids. He then kind of inserts himself into the rest of their holiday and then forces himself into their lives. It was better than some romances that I've read, but the entire aspect of this strange man walking up to your kids and starting to play with them, well, maybe I'm too jaded, but isn't that a little odd? I don't care how much chemistry that you have with this man as a mother. I think that you should think about the safety of your children. Then I read Knock Love Out by Pella Grace. Goodreads told me that the tagline of the book is supposed to be a very sexy romance, but it doesn't say that anywhere in the book or on the cover, so I don't know about that. The story was also not really sexy either. This book is about a woman who is tired of being treated like dirt by her husband, so rather than to get a divorce, she ran off to find a man to have an affair with. And it's not so much that I think that I'd mind reading a book about a woman finding herself after the end of her relationship. But my problem is that there was never any actual character growth. Half of the story was the 2 romantic leads faffing about for page after page after page. It was so bad. There was no actual plot for most of the story. Up next was Getting Schooled by Emma Chase. In it, a college girl hooks up with a hunky guy she met at a bar, only to find out the next day that he was a professor at her university. They dance around the idea of not dating each other before they eventually hook up by the end. As I said earlier, a lot of these college student-teacher romances are all copy-pasted from the exact same plot. The characters are always the same too, only with different names in each book. This one was so bland and forgettable. Then I read Fighting Redemption by Kate McCarthy. The only real difference between this book and most of the other soldier romances was the fact that this book took place in Australia. Warren was in love with his best friend's little sister, but he'd rather join the army than confess his love. However, after his friend got blown up in the Middle East, he and Finley were kind of forced to talk a lot about their feelings for one another. He was kind of terrible for leaving her again for another tour. She was kind of terrible for not telling him that she was pregnant with his kid. It was boring. Moving on. Up next was Losing It by Cora Carmack, another college student-teacher romance book. I can't even begin to tell you any of the finer details about this other than the fact that the male best friend turned into a raging incel when she rejected him. Pretty sure none of the other books had that subplot. Moving on. Under my husband's urging, I read Gatecrashers by Patrick S. Tomlinson. It was a book that tried so hard to be the next Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy without understanding a single thing about what makes Douglas Adams' work so enduring and funny. I barely laughed twice during Gatecrashers. There was barely any plot, and what little there was, it was constantly bounced around from point to point. While there were human characters, every single one of them was so inconsequential to the actual plot. There was no such thing as a main character, since they were, at the heart of it, unimportant to anything, and as such, there was zero character development, because why would there be when not one single person is actually important? And don't get me wrong, because I love Douglas Adams, but this was full of so much cringe and awkwardly dated references that were never funny when they happened, and publishing the book a good 20 years after those references were relevant has sure made this book so much worse for them. And finally, I wrapped up the year with the first book of the Maze Runner series, also titled Maze Runner by James Dashner. In it, a young boy wakes up inside of a maze with a group of other boys. They're at the heart of the maze, where you think that the goal is to get out without dying. But how do you get out when the boys have yet to find an exit in around 2 years? That book was okay, much better than I expected, but it dragged on for so long, often without point, for chapter after chapter. Probably half of this book should have been cut. Plus, I kind of feel like the author had no concept of how groups of people function. I found it difficult to believe that 2 years being trapped in the maze with only other boys from company and no memories, and not one of them decided to start experimenting sexually. Also, I found it kind of odd that none of the boys started to be Cult of the Maze or the Grievers or whatever. And that's a wrap. I think that I didn't forget any books this year, so go me. I wonder what kind of wonderfully awful and awfully wonderful books that I'll read next year.